Back to the channel. I'm here today with the lovely Mr Pryke, and we are here to talk to you today about the witches in Macbeth. Mr Pryke, anything you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to you for inviting me on today to talk about the witches in Macbeth. Macbeth is one of my favourite Shakespeare plays, so much so that I've written a whole book about it for teachers. So yeah, I'm really excited to get going.
Great. So I wanted to do the witches with you because actually, even though they don't appear in many scenes in the actual play, they are a very significant part of the play, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, they only appear in a few select scenes, but their presence is felt even in those scenes they don't appear in as well, particularly through the characters of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So, you know, I think as characters, they're so extremely important to the understanding of the entire thing.
Agreed. Okay, so we're going to jump straight in. So like we usually do with Cold Conversations, we will be sharing a few quotations with you and exploding the quotes. So looking at the quotations in detail for you, and then giving you an exam question at the end that you can attempt using the quotations that we have analysed for you today. So we're going to start off with Act 1, Scene 1, which will be with Mr Pryke. So whenever you're ready.
So I thought I'd start with Act 1, Scene 1, because it's so important in understanding of the rest of the play. And really, it's one of those scenes that I think we have to revisit once we've read the entire play. Obviously, the first time we read it, we'll understand what's going on. Three witches are meeting, they're deciding when they're going to meet again, and they want to meet Macbeth the next time they meet. But really, if we revisit this scene once we've read all 5 acts, there's so much more that we can pick out. So we're going to go through some of those things today. So Shakespeare opens the play with thunder and lightning, and he says, "Enter 3 witches." And so contemporary audiences who are watching in Shakespeare's time, are already going to understand that there is a darkness to this play. They're going to see thunder and lightning as a signifier of witches and witchcraft. And, you know, the supernatural was very much in public discourse during Shakespeare's time. And we're going to talk about that more in a bit, but they're going to see that thunder and lightning as evidence that these characters are witches. And the first witch says, "When shall we 3 meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain?" And so we're opening in the middle of things here. That's usually a question that someone would ask at the end of a conversation. So we as an audience don't know what the witches have been discussing all throughout their conversation, but we're joining them at the end of this conversation when they're planning on meeting once more. And the second witch says, "When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle is lost and won." So hurly-burly is another word for confusion and chaos. And I think that she's referring to the sounds of the battle that we know Macbeth is fighting in. And we find that out in Act 1, Scene 2. So we're joining a country at war here. You know, Scotland is being invaded by foreign countries, and yet underneath all of that chaos and that confusion, there are darker elements at play here too, with the supernatural. And so the second witch says, "When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle is lost and won." So already, only in the 4th line of the play, Shakespeare is introducing these paradoxical statements, talking about the battle being lost and won. For someone to win a battle, someone else has to lose it. We're going to talk more about those paradoxical statements in just a bit. And the third witch says, "That will be ere the set of sun." So this is really highlighting the ability of witches to look into the future. That was one of the abilities that witches were said to have. We've got this image of the sun setting. So the third witch knows the battle will be lost and won during a sunset. And so with that literal darkness that is created through the setting of the sun comes a metaphorical darkness, because the witches are beginning to plot and plan and scheme. And we know, if we've read the whole play at this point, that this is not going to end well for Macbeth. So there's not just an arrival of literal darkness here, but metaphorical darkness as well. And that metaphorical darkness is something which is going to kind of crawl throughout the entire play, and it's only going to get worse from here. Okay, and so also with "that will be ere the set of sun," I quite like that image, because we've talked about how it's a literal darkness and symbolizes a metaphorical darkness arriving, but it also maybe suggests that the sun is setting on King Duncan's reign. Later on, King Duncan is very much associated with light, when Macbeth kind of wrestles with whether he should kill his king. And so, you know, that idea of light disappearing is really created here with that will be ere the set of sun. And so we know that King Duncan is not going to be king for much longer. But of course, that's only something that you're going to really be picking up on during a second reading once you know what happens in the text. So, you know, this is why I think it's really vital to go back and revisit this scene later on. And the first witch asks another question, and she says, where the place? And the second witch answers, upon the heath. Now, a heath is a shrubland habitat, and it's mainly found on infertile acidic soil. So already we know that this is not a nice place to meet, and so it seems only right that the witches should meet there. But I also really like it because it suggests that the witches are going to meet Macbeth beyond civilization. They're going to take him away from civilization and meet him in this really isolated location, to obviously deliver his prophecies to him that he will become Thane of Cawdor, and then become king. But it just seems almost quite secretive. You know, that all of this plotting that they're doing, they're removing him from civilization, from anywhere else, so that they can begin to play their games with him, almost. First witch then says, I come, Grey Malkin Paddock calls. So the witches were said to be accompanied by familiars, and familiars were like spirit animals. And it was one of those things that identified someone as a witch, you know, if you had an animal following you around. And so Grey Malkin and Paddock are these witches' spirit animals. And Grey Malkin was a cat, and Paddock is a toad. All together they chant, and you know, I really love this chant. There's so much you can unpick from these lines. They say, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. And ending that scene on that chant, it's quite creepy. It's quite a strange image. We know that these characters aren't normal as such. And there's a lot we can unpick from these two lines. So something else which is worth noting here is the role that each individual witch plays in this scene. So we have the first witch who really asks all of the questions in this scene, and it demonstrates that she may not have as much foreknowledge as the other two witches in the scene. The second witch has knowledge which is much more definitive, but really it's the third witch which has the most knowledge. And so we see the third witch as that figure of prophecy. So the third witch is the person who is able to tell that the battle is going to be lost and won when the sun sets. And it's the third witch also who says that they will be meeting with Macbeth on that heath. So it's worth, when you're writing about this scene, or certainly considering this scene, thinking about the individual roles of each of those three witches before they join together in their chant, which is fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air.
I was actually going to mention the idea of them being in threes as well, because I think that's quite something that's quite significant as well. And you know,
yeah,
things that are in bad luck usually come in threes, and the link to kind of possibly the Holy Trinity, and I suppose they're the kind of the unholy Trinity in this sense.
Yeah, perfect. Right, so I wanted to pick out these two lines for a quotation explosion because I think, as you can see on your screen, there's so much that you can get out of this. And there's so much more that I could have included on this slide as well. But I think these are the major points. So as I said, the witches chant together, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. And so this is the end of the first scene, and already Shakespeare is introducing a conflict between the idea of appearance and reality. And this is something which is going to continue throughout the rest of the play. So what appears to be the case in Macbeth is not always the truth. And so things that seem fair are going to turn out foul. And in some cases, foul things are going to turn out fair. So for example, the way that Lady Macbeth acts towards King Duncan when King Duncan first arrives at the Macbeth's castle, she appears to play the humble host, this fair host, but it turns out that she's actually foul. You know, underneath that calm, welcoming exterior, she is plotting to kill that king so that she can seize the crown for her husband. On the flip side of that, we've got Act 4, Scene 3, when Malcolm pretends to be this tyrannical figure and says that actually he would be worse than Macbeth if he came back to Scotland and was king. So this foul appearance turns out fair when he actually says that's all an act, and he's just testing Macduff. So have a read through of Act 4, Scene 3 as well, to help you with that idea of fair and foul. But this paradoxical statement is potentially quite confusing for an audience. So already they're learning that they need to question what the characters are saying. And in a sense, they're placing themselves in a similar situation to Macbeth himself. So Macbeth becomes very confused when he hears the witches' prophecies, and he tries to unpick what they say and understand what they say. And, you know, really Act 1 is about him making sense of what the witches have told him. So we're going to be quite wary as an audience, I think, of things that happen in the play now. Remember, we haven't even met Macbeth at this point, so already we're going to be quite suspicious, maybe, of him, especially when his first words echo that fair is foul element of this scene. I think as well, talking about fair is foul, the allure of kingship for Macbeth seems fair, and for Lady Macbeth too, but obviously royalty is going to turn into this foul thing. And of course, it leads to their destruction, it leads to their end. One of my favourite lines of the play is hover through the fog and filthy air. I really like that element of filthy air. Filthy means disgustingly dirty. And it seems strange that it should be paired with the word air, because obviously we think of air as something clean, we think of air as something life-giving. And so Shakespeare is creating this imagery of infection and pollution here. He's basically saying air, this thing that gives us life, has been tainted by the supernatural. And this imagery of infection and pollution, again, is something that runs throughout the rest of the play. So Shakespeare is sowing lots of seeds here that are going to bear fruit later on in later scenes. So, for example, when Lady Macbeth instructs Macbeth to wash his hands, we have this idea of the blood of King Duncan tainting the water, again, something that's pure and life-giving. We also have this idea of infection when King Duncan is murdered. One of the characters says that it was said the earth was feverous and did shake. So we have this theme running through of sickness almost, and it's established here, it's established at this moment, and these pure things are turned evil and bad. Also, the reference to fog here suggests that the truth is obscured, that idea of appearance and reality. We can't quite see what the truth is, and the characters certainly can't in the play either. Hover, of course, references the witch's supernatural abilities. It's just another indication that these people, these characters, are not maybe entirely human. But the one thing I like most, I think, about this line is that repeated F sound, that fricative alliteration. So we have fair is foul and foul is fair. They're quite harsh words, especially when you say them. So if you try speaking them out loud to yourself and really emphasize that F sound, I think it mirrors the harsh nature of this world, and certainly the harsh nature of the witches themselves. And, you know, I've certainly asked myself as a teacher before, why does Shakespeare open Macbeth with all of this? Why does he open the play with witches? And as I mentioned earlier on, Shakespeare really lived and wrote in a society that was deeply suspicious and paranoid about witchcraft. And a lot of that came from King James I himself. And he was really preoccupied with the perceived power of witchcraft and the supernatural over his reign. So much so that he wrote a book on it called Demonology, which was a dissertation on necromancy and witchcraft and the supernatural, and the historical relationships between various methods of divination used from ancient black magic. And so, you know, this is going to scare an audience. They very much believed in the devil. This is going to scare an audience when they first see the play. They know this play is going to be very dark. And as such, especially with the warning that the witches give that appearances are deceiving, it's just going to make them question everything that they see from here on out.
Okay, that's great. So I was going to speak about as well the idea of, you know, the imagery of infection and things like that, because it was known for witches at the time to be able to, you know, kill somebody's crops.
Yeah, and I think it's just a reference as well to this idea of death. I think death from the outset of this play ripples all the way throughout it, all through all 5 acts. And it's just another, as you said, it's just another indication really as to the witch's abilities. You know, influencing how people live as such. So, as you said, they'd kill the farmers' crops, so they're not actually essentially physically harming humans, but they're playing these games and they're plotting all of these things which will affect how people live as such.
This then actually goes quite nicely into the quotation I was going to look at, and this comes from Act 1, Scene 3. And though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed. And this is towards the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3. And the witches are talking about making a sailor suffer because the wife of the sailor refused to give her chestnuts. And so they're talking about, you know, causing harm to him in order to make him suffer and cause his own destruction. Start off with the idea of structure, and this actually goes with Mr Pryke's previous quotations as well. And the idea of the, you know, the use of rhyming couplets within the witch's speech, and the use of tetrameter, which appears as well. So the witches actually speak in a different way to the other more noble characters in the play. And while the other characters can speak in iambic pentameter, they do not. They speak in this different way to kind of show that they are different to the other characters in this sense. They are otherworldly, and it separates them from the noble characters. Also, this idea of having this kind of, it creates kind of a chant type of rhythm, and that kind of may mirror this idea of, you know, witches being able to conjure spells and things like that. And on stage, I think this would kind of create both fear and excitement within the audience to see the witches kind of creating these spells and to be chanting in this way. Then we go with this idea of tempest tossed. It can mean this idea to toss about or agitatedly or violently or thrown into confusion. So it is entertainment for the witches. As Sir was saying, they can't maybe directly hurt humans in a sense, but they find it entertaining to create chaos for them. And it's an opportunity for them to kind of show off their kind of supernatural powers, because you know, they're giving each other wind and things like that. And it also shows us the witches have an influence on a situation, which we do see in Macbeth, but ultimately it is man himself who destroys himself. And so I think that is quite significant to keep in mind. You know, they plant the seed, but it's not them that actually, you know, causes the demise of man in this sense. So Shakespeare's plays on this idea of witches, and he heightens the fear within the audience. And as we were saying before, you know, people did fear them. They feared the idea of them destroying their crops, whatever it is that witches were thought to do. And so this quotation again really will play on this idea for the audience. So there was an act in this time, the mischief following anger, which was kind of a common charge that witches were accused of in this sense. And so witches were mostly seen as being women, usually kind of either single, old, or women that may have a mental disorder in this sense. And so in some way, it's quite easy to blame them. So for example, if a poor woman, for example, wanted to, needed or begged for food for this, for example, and they refused food, then that person who refused them charities, their crops died, it was easy to blame the poor woman for doing that, because it was seen as an act of revenge. And so we see this in Act 1, Scene 3 with, you know, the witch being refused chestnuts by the wife. She's now causing destruction of her husband. And so, yeah, it, as Sir was saying, it plays on this idea of what James I believed in regards to witches. And the fact that they're relating it to the fact that witches could cause kind of shipwrecks relates to James I, who actually went after sailing to Denmark to collect his new wife. He actually was caught in a terrible storm, and it caused one of his ships in his fleet to actually sink. And he actually blamed witches for doing this. He blamed witches for putting a curse on his fleet, causing the destruction of one of his ships. And so again, you can see, especially during the time with Shakespeare, you know, he was kind of well, James I was patron to him, he's going to put things in there that is going to obviously, you know, make the James I happy. And so we see a lot of that here with the idea of the witches. So I think it's quite interesting actually with James I, how influential he was in regards to, you know, kind of the killing of like how many women during the time about something that apparently he became quite skeptical about it as well towards the end. I heard that, you know, even though he believed in this idea of witchcraft, I think even he started to doubt it towards the end. I don't know if that's true or it's just something I've heard.
Yeah, I really like kind of looking at those different historical sources, because he was a writer. You know, he wrote demonology. He wrote something called the Basilican Door, and you know, and so you can really actually track his views of kingship and witchcraft and all of those sorts of things. And it's interesting to get his different views at different times based on his experiences. I also really like, I'm just going to pick up on a bit that you said here about the witches can only influence the situation, and it's ultimately man who destroys himself. Because I think, you know, as English teachers, one of our favourite activities to do when we're studying Macbeth is to ask our classes who is most to blame for Macbeth's downfall. Is it Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, or the witches? And I have lots of students who say the witches, and it's their fault. And I always bring them back to that idea that, remember, they're only influencing that situation. They're not actually destroying Macbeth himself. And I think it's then really nice to draw on Banquo here, because, you know, Banquo receives a set of prophecies just like Macbeth does, yet Banquo doesn't act on them. He sees how they're going to play out. And so you can then really look at Macbeth himself again and say, well, you know, he's decided to act upon those witches' words, yet he didn't have to. He doesn't really show the same restraint as such, maybe, as Banquo. So yeah, I think it's a really good example of how the witches have really got into Macbeth's head here, spurred on by Lady Macbeth. But again, just, you know, talking about the paradoxes, all of these different couplets that the witches are using, you know, the paradoxes really mirror Macbeth's decisions that he has to make. The options that are given to him throughout the play are never really quite clear cut, and his ability to separate truth from fiction becomes less effective as time goes on. And we see that already at the beginning of the play, certainly when, you know, Macbeth and Banquo are talking about the prophecies that they've received.
So that goes on nicely to my next quote. This is from Banquo, after they've received the prophecies. And he says, and oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tells us truths. And so this is when Mr Pryke was saying this idea of the separation here between Banquo and Macbeth. So the idea first of to win us harm, it is the witches want to cause harm. They and by the idea of a win, they are victorious in their manipulation. And so in some way, you know, Banquo is foreshadowing what's going to happen in regards to Macbeth and him believing in the prophecies of the witches. So the idea of obviously win us harm, their main aim is to cause the downfall and destruction of man. And so Banquo is trying to remain rational and aware. He's aware of the tempting influence of the witches. And he's trying to warn Macbeth here to kind of, you know, don't go there. Maybe you should, you know, pull away in that sense and not really succumb to your darkest desires. You see Banquo being loyal in the sense to his god and king, where this is where we start to have the downfall of Macbeth, who goes against that, obviously committing regicide and falling for the influence of the supernatural. And so here as well, Shakespeare's reminding the audience to kind of be watchful for the things that do seem true are usually too good to be true. And so, yes, the witches do tell them truths, so tell us truths, but their truths are unclear. They're, you know, they give these equivocations in this sense. They are ambiguous about what they are saying for a reason. And to say it is for us to, they're manipulating here. And they manipulate Macbeth because he falls for it. Obviously, he becomes the Thane of Cawdor straight after this. And so, you know, this then sets the course of his demise. And so in the 16th century, the devil was believed to be an internal thought and an interior power that compelled the human mind. And so here, Macbeth is allowing the devil, in this sense, to overcome him. The instruments of darkness is a quotation I really like. So instrument is a tool or device that's used to perform a particular piece of work or way of achieving or causing something. And to this sense, that's what they want to do. They are the tool in this sense to allow man to succumb to their darkest desires. And like in the previous quotation about Tempest Toss, it's not them that actually does anything in regards to the actions. They say they're just planting the seed to then watch man kind of destroy himself. And so, you know, they're all about this idea of darkness. They're all about the wickedness and evil, and their connection here to the devil. So yeah, I really, even though this isn't a direct quotation from the witches, it's interesting to see, as I say, the difference between Banquo and Macbeth here, and then allows the audience also to see who are they going to be? Are they going to be the Banquo and remain loyal to James I and loyal to their god, or are they going to be the Macbeth and allow the devil to, you know, take them and do wrong?
I like this quote because it's almost prophetic in itself from Banquo, because he talks about, you know, oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truth, and yet, you know, both Macbeth and Banquo himself, he doesn't know it yet, are going to come to that harm. You know, and he's right. You know, they are telling him a truth, the witches, as such, and it's going to have huge consequences for not only Macbeth but Banquo too. Obviously, when he's murdered by his former ally.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the moment, I think, that he notices the change in Macbeth. He can see that he's kind of succumbing to it in a sense where he's not pulling away, especially when he asks, you know, oh, you know, your sons will be kings. He's already kind of thinking so far in the future, at ways that things that could possibly, you know, harm his ambition and power already. So yeah, I think it's
so quick as well, isn't it? It's so you know, they tell him these prophecies and it shows the power of their words, because, you know, Banquo says, look how our partners rap. So it just shows how little it takes actually for Macbeth's ambition to begin stirring within him. And I think the witches know that when they start to play their games with him.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's when you're saying about, you know, in class who's responsible. I don't think it is the witches. Yes, they say they plant the seed, but, you know, we see from such earlier on, it's actually him that leads to it. It's his ambition. You know, it's very easy to blame the witches or Lady Macbeth, but in actuality, I think it's Macbeth himself, really.
Yeah, I agree.
So here is a practice question that you can do if you want to try out analysis of the quotations that we have given you. So how does Shakespeare present the witches in Act 1 of Macbeth? So I've decided to include the assessment objectives here because it is important that you know them and what you're being graded on in your exam. Marked on AO1, AO2 and AO3 and AO4 for this question. You're awarded 34 marks in total, 30 marks for the question. So you're awarded 12 marks for AO1, 12 marks for AO2 and 6 marks for AO3 and an additional 4 marks for AO4. So as you can see in regards to the weighting, it is important that AO1 and AO2 is, you know, given quite a lot of time in regards to your exam. So AO1 is you being able to show, read, understand and respond to the text, maintain a critical style, develop a personal response and giving textual references to illustrate interpretations. So anything you want to say about AO1 in particular and what students, any tips that they can do for that?
Yeah, I think for AO1, it's all about your interpretation. So you're going to be using words like suggests, implies, so that you really capture those inferences. You know, and obviously backing those inferences up with quotations from the text. I think sometimes students get a bit confused between AO1 and AO2, and AO2, obviously, which we'll talk about in a second, is very much about why a writer has used a particular language technique or a piece of vocabulary. This one is very much your response to the text and what you understand from it. So really, you know, try and get those original ideas in your answer. You know, what does this word or phrase or scene mean to you, and what have you understood from it? And as I said, try and use those phrases like suggests, implies, and that way you know that you're getting your inferences in there.
Yeah, definitely. And when it comes to textual references, trying to make sure that they are well selected and relevant to the points you're trying to make. And we always say as well, this idea of trying to embed the quotations, embed words and phrases within your work, to support your argument, support the ideas that you are making. AO2, yeah, so as you're saying, sometimes there can be a confusion with AO1 and AO2, but AO2 is the analysis. It's where you're looking at a deeper level, the effects of things like language, form and structure used by a writer. So I always say to my students, you know, a writer does something for a reason, and doesn't have to be a writer, it can be a director of a film as well. They want to influence their reader or audience in a particular way. They want you to either think, feel, question, or read or learn or understand something about a text or the film, or whatever it is. And so it's important that you are actually looking at how the reasons why they have done what they've done. And I think sometimes students struggle with that a bit.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, I just also want to say something about the second bullet point there about the relevant subject terminology, is that you know, while students are struggling with what you've just mentioned, some students also struggle with trying to think of what a particular word or a particular phrase is. And subject terminology doesn't always have to be a particular word class or a particular language device. So you're talking about a play here, and so it's really important that kind of you write about it as a play. So words like play, scene, act also do come under that subject terminology kind of list. So, you know, a bit of advice for AO2 would be, if you're under a time limit, don't be too pressured by working out whether something is a noun or a verb or an adjective, because you can pick up those subject terminology marks in other ways as well.
Yeah, and I think that's important with a play as well, that, you know, different things you can talk about. You know, this idea of the stage directions, like Macbeth talking aside, for example, as you say, the use of the fact that they, in the stage directions, they enter in thunder, lightning and rain. You know, these are all the kind of things I think sometimes students forget when it comes to a play, that you can be able to talk about.
Yeah, and also I think, you know, I've seen lots of student answers where, you know, and I completely understand why they do this, because they're under lots of time pressure, but they'll write about Macbeth, but they'll refer to readers, and they'll refer to the novel. And because it is a play, you need to talk about a play and an audience. And you're not necessarily going to lose marks if you refer to readers or a novel, but you're not going to gain them either. And so it's easy just to put those words in the correct terminology, because you know you're then going to be picking up your subject terminology marks. Whereas if you refer to a novel and readers, you're not going to be picking up anything as such. So, you know, make it easy for yourself and try and look for those small, easy wins. So you've just got to remember, Macbeth is a play and I'm writing about an audience.
Yes, that's a good point. And then AO3 is the connections between the text and the context. Again, I think a lot of students struggle with this and just think, I have to get context in there. And then they start talking about contextual factors that aren't really relevant to the points that they're making.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the students struggle with this.
Yeah, I think it's, for this one, it's almost a bit like an afterthought, because students are so keen to get down their analysis. And so for AO3, it's just really important to do a few things, actually. One, to avoid huge sweeping statements. I think, you know, you see that quite a lot as a teacher in exam responses. So, you know, a Lady Macbeth response, for example, might have, Lady Macbeth is challenging the role of women at the time because all women were expected to cook and clean in the house. And they'll leave it at that. And not only is it a huge sweeping statement, but it's just wrong as well. So, you know, try and avoid those big incorrect statements. And I would also say, try and avoid bolting on that context to the end of a paragraph. You know, a higher level answer is going to be one that weaves that context in throughout your analysis. And you can do that by thinking about Shakespeare and what he was influenced by, or any writer, you know, regardless of what text you're studying. So, you know, context isn't just about what life was like at the time, it's about what influenced a writer to write in that particular way. So I always tell my students to use phrases like, you know, if we talk about the witches, Shakespeare may have included the witches at this point because he was influenced by, and then they can, you know, finish off that answer and talk about the supernatural and the things that we've talked about in this video. You know, you can also use analytical verbs. So Shakespeare may be criticizing, Shakespeare may be exposing, Shakespeare may be challenging. So, you know, think of those analytical verbs. to get that AO3 in there. And it's just a really easy way of integrating that context fully into an analytical paragraph rather than bolting it on at the end.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes nicely with AO4 as well, I think, in regards to kind of the vocabulary that they use, and using these type of verbs and stuff to highlight their points. Because as you were saying, AO4 is additional 4 marks on the 30 marks that you're given for the question. And so this is based on you being able to use accurate spag, but also about how you use sentence structure and vocabulary, not just to make your writing clear, but can you use it for effect as well? And I think, that's maybe either hopefully an easy 4 marks for some students.
Yeah, I think so. It's just, with that range of vocabulary that you're using, it's just about elevating your piece just to sound that a little bit more sophisticated and helping you build that style for AO1. So, there are 4 different assessment objectives there, but I think AO4 is really helpful for all 3 of those, just to help students raise their game just a little bit more and pick up all of the marks on offer in the small amount of time that you have to write in.
Yeah. Okay, and that is it. So if you want to, you can share some of your analysis paragraphs below in the chat, and I'll try to give you some feedback if I can. And yes, thank you, Mr Pryke, for joining me today. Hopefully,
thank you for having me.
Oh, it was great. Thank you. Hopefully you guys found that really helpful. I know I did. I'm sure even teachers watching this may find this helpful too. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. You can find Mr Pryke on Twitter. Can you tell your Twitter handle, please?
Yeah, so that's spryke2, and I'm always posting kind of past paper questions and things on there, so have a look. You might find some resources that you find useful for your revision. And
if you're a teacher watching this, please get his book, because it is amazing, honestly.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
To be fair, I think even as a student, just ignoring the teacher activities, but I think it's great, and there's so many things you can pick up on that you might not have known about Macbeth before. I know I definitely have.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. Okay, until next time, see you.